My CEO laughed when I sued for harassment. His smile died when my broken phone started playing every word he said. My name is Damiana Sienna Hale and I am 55 years old. I sat in that cold, leather chair and watched Julian Vane throw his head back. He didn't just laugh, he roared like I was the funniest thing he had ever seen. I am 55 years old, and I have given this company my best years, but to him, I was just a joke. I had finally gathered the courage to present my harassment claim, sitting across from him and his army of expensive lawyers. My hands were shaking as I pushed my phone across the table. I told them the evidence was all right there. Julian didn't even look at the screen. He picked up the device with 2 fingers, smirked at me, and dropped it straight into his glass of ice water. We all watched the bubbles rise. A dead phone is a dead career, Damiana, he whispered, leaning over the table until I could smell his expensive cologne. Now, get out of my sight before I really get mean. I stood up with my dignity barely holding on. My legs felt like jelly, but I kept my head high until I reached the hallway. I didn't get far before Julian's top fixer, Marcus, caught up to me. He was a younger man, sharp and cruel, who did all the dirty work. He followed me right to the elevator, a nasty little grin on his face. You should have taken the hush money when we offered it, Damiana, he said, sounding almost disappointed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the dripping, wet phone. He had fished it out of the glass after I turned away. He pressed the cold, dead metal into my palm. Here, he mocked. Keep it as a souvenir of your big failure. You're done in this town. The elevator doors slid shut on his smug face, leaving me alone in the silence. If you want to see how I make them regret every word, hit subscribe for more revenge stories. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing back to what I used to call the golden days. When I first started at Vane Tower, I was Julian's rising star. I was older than the usual recruits, but I was smart and fast. He used to call me into his office for private brainstorms and even invited me onto his yacht to discuss the future of the company. At first, I felt special, like my hard work was finally being seen by the top men. But slowly, the lines began to blur. Those brainstorming sessions started feeling more like traps. Julian made it very clear that my next big promotion depended on more than just my skills. He wanted things from me that I wasn't willing to give. The night I finally stood my ground and said no to him, the mask slipped. He didn't stay charming. He looked at me with cold, dark eyes and promised he would erase me from existence. When I finally got inside my house, I didn't cry. I didn't scream or throw things. I had been planning for this moment for a very long time. I walked straight to my bedroom and moved the heavy rug aside. I knelt on the floor and pulled up a hidden floorboard in the corner of my closet. Inside was a small, high-tech charging dock glowing with a tiny blue light. I pulled a second phone out of my pocket, the real one. It was identical to the one Julian had drowned in his water glass, right down to the tiny scratch on the corner. I had spent a month's salary making sure the dummy phone looked perfect. I set the real phone onto the dock and watched the screen flicker to life. Julian thought he had destroyed my life with a glass of water. He didn't realize that the broken phone was just a toy. The real evidence had never even left my pocket. I sat on the floor and watched the progress bar as the real phone synced to a secure cloud server. I had 6 months of audio saved on that device. I had recorded everything from the moments he tried to touch me to the times he threatened my job. But as the files loaded, I heard something I didn't expect. It wasn't just harassment. During our most intimate meetings, Julian had been so arrogant that he bragged about his illegal business deals right in front of me. He thought I was too small to matter. I listened to him laugh about insider trading and lying to the board of directors. Then, the audio changed. I heard a muffled sound coming from the background of one recording in his office. It was the sound of a woman crying, sounding absolutely terrified. It wasn't me. It was someone else. I replayed that part of the recording over and over again. The crying was soft, but it was full of a deep, shivering pain that made my skin crawl. I knew that office well, but I had never heard anyone in that state while I was around. I began to do some digging into the company records I had saved before they cut off my access. I looked for anyone who had left the company suddenly over the last year. That's when I found the name, Sarah Miller. She had been Julian's head secretary for years, a quiet woman who always kept her head down. Then, one Tuesday, she was just gone. No party, no goodbye email, nothing. The official record said she retired early for health reasons. I didn't believe that for a second. I spent the rest of the night searching for her address. I finally found a lead that took me to a dusty trailer park 3 towns over. The drive to the trailer park was long and lonely. When I finally found Sarah's place, it looked like it was falling apart. I knocked on the metal door, and a woman peeked through the blinds with eyes that looked like they hadn't slept in months. When she saw me, she almost closed the door, but I whispered that I worked for Julian Vane. She let me in, but she was shaking so hard she could barely hold her glass of water. I told her about my claim and the recordings. Sarah looked at me with pity. "He didn't just harass me, Damiana," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It's so much worse than you think. He has a secret suite in the office. He calls it the Red Room. It's in the basement, hidden away where the cameras don't reach." She grabbed my arm, her grip tight. "He doesn't just talk down to women there. He destroys them." I couldn't stop thinking about what Sarah said. A hidden room in a building I had walked through every day for years? I knew the Vane Tower inside and out, or at least I thought I did. I drove back to the city that night and sat in my car across from the gleaming glass skyscraper. I needed to get back inside, but my keycard was dead. I thought about the elevator layout. I remembered how the lights blinked when we went down to the parking levels. The elevator panel showed B1 for the first basement and B3 for the deep storage. There was no button for AB2. It was just a blank space on the metal plate. I realized that the elevator must skip that floor unless you had a special code or a specific key. If you want to see how I sneak into his dark secrets, hit subscribe for more revenge stories. I knew I needed a way in, and I knew exactly who had the key. Marcus, the fixer, was the only one Julian trusted with his dirtiest secrets. I also knew Marcus had a weakness. Despite being a predator like his boss, he had always had a strange, creepy thing for me. He liked the power dynamic of being younger and in control. I called him and put on my best broken woman voice. I told him I was scared and that I needed to talk about a new job before Julian ruined me completely. We met at a dim bar near the office. I dressed the way I knew he liked and leaned in close, acting like I was hanging on his every word. While he was busy bragging about his power and trying to touch my hand, I leaned against him. With one quick, practice motion, I swiped his biometric keycard right out of his jacket pocket. I waited until midnight to go back to the tower. The night guard was someone I had bought coffee for 100 times, and he let me in to collect my last check without a second thought. I slipped into the service elevator and pressed Marcus's card against the sensor. Suddenly, a hidden light for B2 glowed red. The elevator groaned and descended into the dark. When the doors opened, I stepped into a luxury suite that looked like a nightmare. It was filled with expensive furniture, but the walls were lined with tiny, hidden camera lenses. There were rows of filing cabinets and a massive computer server humming in the corner. I started opening drawers, my heart hammering against my ribs. Finally, I found it. A thick, red folder with my name printed on the front in bold, black letters. I wasn't just a victim. I was a file. I opened the folder with trembling fingers. Inside were hundreds of photos of me, taken from angles I never noticed. Julian hadn't just been a predator in the office, he had been stalking me. Then I saw the USB drive taped to the back cover. I slid it into a laptop on the desk, holding my breath. The video file that popped up was from the night on his yacht, the night I said no. The footage was crystal clear. It showed Julian cornering me, his face twisted with rage when I pushed him away. It recorded him screaming that he would kill me if I ever told a soul what happened. I watched myself shivering, fighting to get away from him. It was the ultimate proof of his crimes. Suddenly, I heard a heavy thud from the hallway. The elevator was moving. The door to the B2 floor clicked open, and the lights began to hum. I didn't have time to run for the elevator. I scrambled toward the back of the room and squeezed myself into a large, dark wardrobe filled with Julian's spare suits. I pulled the door shut just as the main lights flickered on. Through a tiny crack in the wood, I saw Julian walk in. He wasn't alone. He was leading a young girl by the arm, one of the new interns from the marketing floor. My heart broke as I heard him start to use the exact same lines he had used on me. He told her she was special, a rising star, and that he could make her a millionaire. I reached into my pocket to make sure my real phone was recording every second. Suddenly, the phone began to vibrate violently. A call was coming in. The buzzing sounded like a chainsaw in the quiet room. I clamped my hand over my pocket, praying the thick suits would muffle the sound. Julian paused, his head turning toward the wardrobe like a predator catching a scent. "Did you hear that?" he asked the girl. I held my breath until my lungs burned. Thankfully, the girl started crying, and the sound distracted him. I waited until they moved into the inner lounge area before I moved. I spotted a narrow ventilation duct near the floor. I crawled inside, the metal scraping against my skin, and dragged myself through the dust until I reached the parking garage. I leaned against my car, gasping for air. I pulled out my phone to see who had almost gotten me caught. It was a restricted number. I called it back, and a cold, sharp voice answered. Damiana? This is Vivian Vane. We need to meet. I met Julian's wife, Vivian, the next morning at a quiet art gallery. She didn't look like a woman in pain, she looked like a general going to war. She sat me down and told me she had known about Julian's hobbies for years. She didn't care about his affairs, but she wanted his empire. I have an ironclad prenup, Damiana, she said, sipping her tea. I get nothing if I leave him for simple cheating. But if he is convicted of a felony, the company becomes mine. She looked at me with cold, calculating eyes. She wanted the Red Room footage to bypass their legal agreement. She promised me that if I gave her the evidence to destroy him, she would give me the keys to the kingdom. Give me the videos, she whispered, and I will make sure you never have to work another day in your life. I didn't give her the files yet. I didn't trust her any more than I trusted him. 2 days later, the real war began. Julian's lawyers filed a massive countersuit against me. They weren't just denying my claims, they were accusing me of defamation and corporate espionage. They claimed I had stolen company secrets to sell to their rivals. They sent a legal notice demanding that I hand over every electronic device I owned for forensic testing. They wanted to find the real phone before I could use it. My lawyer, a shark named Elena whom I had hired with my last bit of savings, just smiled when she read the papers. They are scared, Damiana, she said. They are trying to bully us into a corner. We'll see them at the discovery hearing on Friday. Bring the broken phone. While I prepared for court, Julian went on a national talk show to destroy my name. I sat in my small kitchen, watching him look into the camera with fake tears in his eyes. He painted me as a disgruntled, obsessed employee who couldn't handle being rejected by a man of his stature. He lied about my work history and said I had been stalking him for months. The world believed him. By that evening, my social media was flooded with death threats. People I had known for years blocked my number. I walked out to my car the next morning only to find every window smashed into glittering shards of glass. A note was taped to the steering wheel. Liar. I felt the weight of the world trying to crush me, but the anger inside was starting to turn into a steady, freezing flame. I was cleaning glass out of my hair when Marcus showed up at my driveway. He didn't look smug this time. He looked dangerous. He told me he could make all the threats and the broken windows go away if I just signed a paper saying I had made it all up. He stepped into my personal space, leaning in close. I could see the sweat on his forehead. He tried to kiss me, a move that felt like half a threat and half a desperate urge to own me. I didn't flinch. I felt a wave of disgust so strong it gave me a sudden, sharp clarity. I spat right in his face, watching the shock take over his eyes. I'm not disappearing, Marcus, I hissed, wiping my mouth. I'm expanding. Tell Julian to get ready for the show. I spent the next 48 hours with a young hacker Sarah had introduced me to. We didn't just save the files, we turned them into a weapon. We created a sound trigger software and loaded it onto the dummy phone Julian had tried to drown. The plan was brilliant and terrifying. The moment Julian spoke at the next hearing, his specific voice frequency would act like a key. It would trigger a massive broadcast to every device connected to the Vane Tower network. I spent the night practicing my calm face in the mirror. I needed to look defeated so he would feel brave enough to talk. If you want to see the moment the predator becomes the prey, hit subscribe for more revenge stories. My heart was pounding, but my hands were finally still. The hearing room was packed with reporters and cameras. Julian sat at the front, looking like a king on a throne. He was wearing an expensive navy suit and a smug smile that told the world he had already won. When the judge asked for my opening statement, my lawyer simply stood up and placed the broken, water-damaged phone on the center of the evidence table. Julian actually let out a small, mocking laugh that echoed through the room. That piece of junk again, Damiana? He asked, leaning into his microphone. Are you really going to waste the court's time with a dead toy? As soon as his voice hit the air, the phone didn't just turn on, its speakers crackled to life at 200% volume, vibrating against the wood of the table. Julian's smile died instantly. The speakers weren't playing music, they were playing the recording from the yacht. His own voice filled the room, loud and clear. I don't care if she says no. Everyone has a price, and I own the bank. The lawyers tried to lung for the table, but my lawyer blocked them with a sharp look. The audio didn't stop there. It shifted to a recording of Julian bragging about bribing the very judge who was sitting on the bench that morning. The room went silent, then exploded into chaos. The judge turned a ghostly shade of white, his gavel trembling in his hand. He didn't even wait for an objection. He recused himself on the spot and fled the room as the press began screaming questions at Julian. While the courtroom descended into madness, my hacker was finishing the job. The sound trigger hadn't just activated the phone, it had opened a backdoor into the company's internal Slack and email servers. Suddenly, every employee at Vane Tower, from the janitors to the vice presidents, saw their screens freeze. The Red Room videos began to play on every monitor in the building. They saw the hidden basement, the secret cameras, and the real Julian Vane. On the courtroom monitors, the footage of him attacking me played on a loop. Julian looked at me, and for the first time in 20 years, the smile was truly, finally dead. His face was a mask of gray stone. He looked like a man who had just realized the floor beneath him was actually a trapdoor, and I was the one holding the lever. Julian didn't wait for the police to arrive at the courthouse. He pushed through the crowd of reporters like a panicked animal. He signaled for Marcus, and they sprinted toward a black SUV waiting at the curb. I watched from the courthouse steps as they sped away toward the private airfield on the edge of the city. He thought he could fly to a country with no extradition laws and hide behind his mountains of stolen cash. He thought his private jet was his golden ticket to freedom. What he didn't know was that I had been thinking 10 steps ahead of him for months. I had spent a lot of time talking to the people Julian treated like furniture. I knew his schedule, I knew his habits, and I especially knew his pilot. Julian scrambled onto the plane, screaming at the pilot to take off immediately. The engines roared, but the jet didn't move toward the runway. Instead, it just began to circle the tarmac in slow, mocking loops. Julian hammered on the cockpit door, cursing and demanding to know what was happening. That's when the plane's intercom system crackled to life. It wasn't the pilot's voice that came through the speakers, it was the rest of my recordings. The pilot was my younger brother, a man Julian had hired because of his impressive resume, never realizing we shared a last name. My brother played the audio of Julian admitting to the fraud that had ruined hundreds of families. As the plane circled, Julian looked out the window and saw the blue and red lights of 20 police cars waiting at the hangar. Marcus was the first to realize the ship was sinking. He had stayed on the tarmac, watching the police swarm the plane. Before the officers could grab him, he ran toward my car. He didn't come to attack me, he came to bargain. He was sweating and shaking, his cool fixer persona completely shattered. He pulled a small, encrypted hard drive from his pocket and pressed it into my hand. "It's the master password," he wheezed. "It opens Julian's black budget accounts. All the bribe money, the offshore holdings, everything. Take it." He looked at the handcuffs being pulled out by the officers nearby and then back at me with a desperate, pathetic hope. "I always liked you better anyway, Damiana," he lied. I just looked at him with pure disgust as the police tackled him to the pavement. This is where my real justice begins. I didn't just want Julian in a jail cell, I wanted to take every single thing he had ever stolen. Using the black budget passwords Marcus gave me, I spent the next 48 hours working with a team of forensic accountants. We leaked the news of Julian's arrest and the fraud to the press, causing Vane Tower stock to plummet to zero. While the world was panic selling, I used Julian's own hidden offshore millions to start buying up every single share of devalued stock. By the time the sun rose on Monday morning, the board of directors had a new surprise. I walked into the building I had been fired from, no longer an obsessed ex-employee. I was now the majority shareholder. I own the company now, Julian. Hit subscribe to see how I clean house. I didn't go home to celebrate. I went straight to the county jail. I wanted to see him behind bars while the news was still fresh. I sat behind the thick glass partition, wearing the sharp navy suit I had bought for my first promotion, the one he had mocked. I even wore his favorite silk power tie, the one he said only real leaders could pull off. When they led Julian out, he looked like a ghost. His hair was messy, and his expensive shirt was wrinkled and stained. He stared at me, his mouth hanging open as I placed my new CEO business card against the glass. "I'm the boss now, Julian," I said, my voice echoing in the small booth. "And your first act as a minority holder is to sign over your remaining shares as a settlement to your victims. If you don't, I'll make sure the DA sees the offshore tax files too." The moment the papers were signed, I went back to the tower. My first order as CEO was to clear out the B2 floor. I didn't just lock it, I transformed it. I hired a team of designers to tear out the dark wood and the hidden cameras. I turned that secret red room into a bright, open counseling center, and a free legal clinic for any person who had suffered workplace harassment. I wanted the place where he destroyed lives to be the place where they were rebuilt. The news of the transformation went viral, and for the first time in years, the Vane Tower, now renamed, stood for something good. But as I was looking through the digital server one last time before the technicians wiped it, my heart stopped. I found a hidden folder tucked inside a system file. It was a video of me. I sat in the dark office and clicked on the file with a shaking hand. It wasn't a video of a fight or an attack. It was a video from 3 years ago, during a weekend retreat. It showed me and Julian in a moment I thought was private, quiet, and completely consensual. Back then, I had actually trusted him for a brief moment. In the video, I looked happy, laughing at something he said. It was my one true weakness. If this video leaked, the world would see me as a hypocrite. They would say I wasn't a victim, but a jealous lover who turned on him when things went south. My reputation as a pure crusader for justice would be ruined in seconds. My breathing grew shallow as I realized Julian had a dead man's switch set to release it if his heart rate ever stayed elevated for too long. I had to find the physical server that held the switch before the timer ran out. Julian was clever, he hadn't kept it in the building. I tracked the IP address to a small private island he owned off the coast. I didn't call the police. I couldn't risk the data being handled by anyone else. I hired a private boat and raced across the water as the sun began to set. The island was quiet, dominated by a modern glass house that looked like a bird of prey. I broke the lock on the front door and ran toward the basement where the cooling fans were humming. My heart was hammering in my ears, but when I reached the server room, I froze. The drive was already gone. I turned around to find Vivian Vane standing in the doorway, holding the glowing black box in her hand. Vivian didn't look like the helpful wife anymore. She looked like a predator who had finally caught her prey. She laughed, a cold, sharp sound that made the room feel like ice. "You really thought I was a victim, Damiana?" she asked, tossing the drive up and catching it. "I was the one who suggested he record everything. I'm the architect of this entire game." She explained that she had used Julian's needs to gather dirt on everyone, including him, so she could eventually take the company for herself. She had let me do the dirty work of taking him down so she wouldn't have to get her hands dirty with a trial. "You're just the face of the movement, Damiana," she sneered, her eyes glowing with greed. "I'm the brain. Step aside and give me the CEO chair, or this video goes to every news outlet in the country." I stood in that dark basement and looked Vivian in the eye. For a second, I felt that old fear creeping back in. She had the one thing that could make the world turn on me. She expected me to crumble, to beg, or to offer her the keys to the company. But I was 55 years old, and I had already died 1,000 deaths in that boardroom. I realized that her power relied on my shame, and I was finished being ashamed. "You think you can scare me with my own humanity?" I asked, stepping closer to her. Vivian raised the drive like a weapon, her thumb hovering over the upload button. "One click, Damiana. One click and the saint of the corporate world is just another story for the tabloids." I didn't stop. I looked her right in her cold, greedy face and smiled. "Go ahead," I said softly. "I'll release it myself first." I didn't wait for her to react. I pulled out my own phone and started a live stream to every major news network and social media platform. The light from the screen illuminated the dark server room. I didn't hide. I didn't use a filter. I told the world exactly what Vivian was holding. I admitted that I had once trusted a monster and that I had been human enough to want to be loved. He tried to use my humanity against me, I told the millions of viewers watching. But I am not ashamed of my past. I am only ashamed that I stayed quiet for so long. The response was an immediate, massive wave of support. The public didn't see a hypocrite. They saw a woman who was tired of being blackmailed. Vivian's face fell as she realized her greatest weapon had just turned into a useless piece of plastic. The tide turned faster than Vivian could calculate. While she was standing there in shock, I revealed the second half of my discovery. I had found the logs on the server showing that Vivian hadn't just known about the Red Room, she had helped fund it to gather leverage on Julian's political enemies. She wasn't a silent partner, she was the BlackBerry queen of the blackmail ring. I played the audio of her discussing the costs of the hidden cameras. The police, whom I had secretly called the moment I arrived on the island, swarmed the house. They didn't come for me. They walked straight to Vivian and snapped the cuffs onto her wrists. The woman who thought she was the smartest person in the room was led away in silence, her empire crumbling before she even got to sit on the throne. A week later, I stood on the top floor of the building. I officially signed the papers to rename it Sienna Heights, in honor of the middle name I had shared with my grandmother, a woman who never got to use her voice. My first act as the permanent CEO was a satisfying one. I called the entire legal team that had laughed at me in Chapter 1 into the boardroom. They sat there, sweating and avoiding my gaze. I didn't say a word. I just placed a stack of pink slips on the table. "You're all fired," I said. "And I've already sent your disciplinary records to the Bar Association." The only person I kept was Marcus. I didn't keep him as a friend. I kept him as my personal dog, making him fetch coffee and file papers under the watchful eye of a new security team. The victory was sweet, but it was also lonely. One evening, a package arrived at my desk from the state penitentiary. It was a handwritten note from Julian. I opened it and saw his shaky, desperate scrawl. "You think you won, Damiana," the note read. "You're just like me now. Cold. Calculating. Alone in that big office. You traded your heart for a chair." I looked around the massive, silent room with its floor-to-ceiling windows. For a moment, his words stung. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass, wondering if the battle had stripped away the part of me that could still feel. Was I becoming the very thing I had fought so hard to destroy? If you want to see how I prove him wrong, hit subscribe for the final payback. I took a deep breath and looked at the pile of work on my desk. I didn't let Julian's bitter words take root in my mind. To prove him wrong, I decided to fill the silence of the vain tower with the voices of those he tried to silence. I threw a grand redemption gala right in the main lobby. I didn't invite the city's fake socialites or the politicians who had looked the other way. Instead, the guest list was made up entirely of the shadow victims, the women and men Julian had stepped on to build his height. I watched as Sarah, the secretary from the trailer park, walked into the room wearing a stunning gown and looking like $1 million. I didn't just give them a party, I gave them their lives back. Every single one of them was offered a high-level position in my new company. We weren't just a business anymore. We were a fortress of survivors, and I finally felt the coldness in my chest begin to melt away. A few nights later, I sat in my office with the original broken phone. I had kept it as a reminder, but I realized there was one last encrypted clip I hadn't managed to open until now. My hands were steady as I finally cracked the code. I expected more threats or more evidence of fraud. Instead, it was a video of Julian talking to himself in his car, recorded by his own dashcam. His voice was thick and strange. "I actually loved her," he whispered to the empty car, sounding like a broken man. "That's why I had to destroy her. She was the only one who actually saw me." I sat in the silence of the penthouse, listening to the man who ruined my life admit his own pathetic weakness. I thought about the 2 years of gaslighting and the months of fear. I didn't feel pity. I simply hit the delete button without listening to the end. I knew that personal revenge wasn't enough. I needed to change the world so this would never happen to another woman. I spent the next several months working with lawmakers to pass a new bill called the Sienna Act. It was a radical piece of legislation that made it completely illegal for any corporation to use non-disclosure agreements to cover up cases of harassment or abuse. I spent my days in the Capitol, testifying before committees and facing down the same lobbyists who used to take Julian out for golf. I didn't back down an inch. When the governor finally signed the act into law, I stood right behind him, holding the pen. I had turned my private pain into a public shield. I realized then that power isn't about how many people you can control, it's about how many people you can set free from the fear of speaking their truth. Despite my new life, I still felt a lingering sense of caution. Every day for a month, an anonymous bouquet of white roses arrived at my desk. There was never a card, just the flowers. At first, I thought it was Marcus trying to get back into my good graces, or perhaps a lingering threat from Julian's remaining followers. I used the company security cameras to track the delivery person back to the local florist. It turned out the roses weren't from a ghost of my past. They were from the judge who had recused himself during that first explosive hearing. He had spent the last few months cleaning up the judicial system after his own close call with Julian's corruption. He met me for coffee and told me I was the most courageous person he had ever met. "Damiana," he said, leaning in. "The city needs you. I want you to run for office." I stood on the balcony of my penthouse, looking out over the city lights. I thought about the woman who had sat in that boardroom months ago, clutching a broken phone and praying for a miracle. Julian had laughed at me because he thought power was a voice that screams and a hand that takes. He learned the hard way that true power is a phone that listens and a woman who refuses to be forgotten. I looked at the legal documents on my desk, ready to start my campaign for the Senate. My life was no longer defined by the men who tried to erase it. The line was busy, Julian. I whispered into the night air, feeling the cool wind on my face. I had to hang up on you. I walked back inside and closed the door on the past, ready to build a future where no one would ever be a joke again. Thank you. Please like, share and subscribe for more. Also turn on your notification bell so you be the first to get our next shocking revenge story.